So what? No, normally when we get these things off and running, what we'll do is a quick intro. So it'll be like, hey, it's Scott. Hey, it's Mark. Hey, Mark, you got somebody there's Bob. Hey, Bob. Bob's boom. So I'll say like two words about you. That's it. But don't think that's the end of the intro. So
Okay.
then Scott and I generally do a little background, and we'll probably talk about the fact that many of you may have tuned in to jancast 160 and 161, 162, 163 was we got a lot of feedback, huge a spike in listener count based on the fact that we were exploring misinformation related to electrostatic sprayers. And
Okay.
so within that theme, there's lots of other instrumentation that's being used within the industry that also suffers from either a lack of information or in some cases misinformation or misuse. And that allows us to go into this. And then we may tell little funny stories about our first involvement with it 126 years ago. But then we'll be able to throw it over to you.
Okay.
And then I'll do a much more detail. Like, I'm really happy to have Bob here. Bob and I did a thing together, and here's
Right.
what Bob's about. He's president of strategic consulting, and I'll run through that. And that kind of gives you a really solid bio. And then you jump in. But what I want to also suggest is, and then you do a lot of podcasts, so you know where I'm going with this, is that at any point where it's comfortable, pause or throw a question back to us
Right.
so that we create the conversational aspect.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
And that's kind of neat. It's good for the listeners. So, and then when we get near the end, Scott will say thanks, and then we'll probably say some funny words and tune out. Be careful not to reference dates because this is
Yeah.
in the
It's
can
evergreen.
for yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One
Okay.
other technical question. I do have headphones, but I'm not wearing them. Should I put them on for the audio?
No,
Your
you
audio is
sound-
great.
Yeah, you sound good.
All right, but I'm
Yeah.
also picking up you though. That's so you too.
It's not echoing or anything. So
Okay, then good. Then
No
this is
echo.
Yeah.
No, that's a good looking podcasting mic too.
yeah, that's for the food safety magazine's equipment. I use it all the time. I get that question.
Yeah,
I get accused of being an AM radio DJ.
Yeah, really. Yeah. Cool. Okay, well, let's get started. Everybody get their phone on. Do not disturb.
Got it.
All that jazz.
That has happened to me, Bob, like more than once.
Never know.
And usually Scott pokes fun at me live.
Right.
So,
And we generally don't edit this. So
Okay,
okay.
yeah, we're kings of the one take.
I like that.
Okay, we're all set. Everybody ready?
Ready.
Okay. On three. 1, 2, 3. Hey, Scott Jordan and Mark Warner here for Jancast number 164 for Thursday, February 29th, 2024. And I think that means we're about a month away from spring, if my calculations are correct, but don't hold me to that.
Got to stay optimistic when it comes to the weather.
So, hey,
Yeah, I gotta
Mark,
hope so.
I know we have a special guest with us today, but how's everything going?
Everything's going good and anxious to see spring come along. Yeah, I'm really thrilled to have Bob Ferguson on as a guest today. Bob and I go pretty far back, actually. We were involved with doing some co-presenting in some training classes, and for whatever reason, I found out I liked him. So, so it turned out to be like a really good fit. So, really happy to have Bob on the show. And part of this, Scott, dates back to like the beginning of the year. Like we've had some pretty good. What has the turnout been for the earlier Jancast we've done this year?
Yeah, well, off the charts. I guess it was that the first comment in number 160 where I said all those green electrostatic sprayers are only good for water and plants. And the next thing you know, the whole thing blew up. So we're gonna hopefully delve into ATP meters the same way, but you never know, right?
Well, the best part about all that is that you don't know what you don't know, and
Right.
we're in that same category. And really, we were expressing things that we had seen on different types of research papers, and they had come to a certain conclusion. So we kind of did the leap of logic and said, "Well, they all can't work." And somebody said, "Well, that's not true. There is some differences." And a gentleman by the name of Steve Cooper kind of reached out to us and said, there are many that don't work, you're right, but there are some that do. And he was a scientist in electrostatics. And we had a great show where he dispelled some of the misinformation and he educated me and Scott on things that we really didn't know about. And it was a great show. And then we liked that whole concept of there's a lot of instruments being used, tools being used in our industry that either people have a serious lack of information about, or even in some cases, there's some misinformation out there. And it kind of led us to talking about ATP. So, and Scott, that kind of covers where we're at now, but you and I have some history with ATP going back 20 years.
I guess it was 20 plus years. I think Bullen was responsible for bringing ATP, the concept of using ATP meters, into the Jansan industry. Now, I must admit, there were other companies that kind of stole our idea, and I won't mention them other than it's a big yellow thing that sucks up everything in the bathroom. But other than that,
that was a giveaway right there.
Yeah. Well, you gotta know the industry, right? But so yeah, we've had a long history with ATP meters, and they're great. It's a great product, and there's a good purpose for them in the right circumstances. And I'm sure Bob's going to tell us about that.
Well, we were doing a trade show, ISSA show, actually.
Yep.
And we had in our booth a representative of a ATP meter company who had spent her time primarily in the food service sector. Yep. And we were intrigued of the potential applications into Jansan. So that's why, Scott, you said we were like the first. We even got interviewed by Bill Griffin himself.
Oh, yeah.
This handheld tool, which he called a recorder. Completely unlike nowadays, it's all iPhone, right? But he recorded the interview too and said, "How's this going to work?" And we said, "Oh, well, you can detect cleanliness levels." And I remember at that show, Bob, you're going to get a kick out of this. We were doing all kinds of weird stuff with it because we didn't know any better. And one of the things we did is we were swabbing people's hands, right? And then getting these like horrific readings. And I remember the one time we swabbed this guy's hands and he like turned to go and get a hot dog, and we took a reading and it was like worse than the driver's side car mat. It was like, oh my God. We're like, wait, stop. And so he comes back and said, what? We're like, you don't want to eat a hot dog with those hands. So we shot some hand sanitizer onto his hand, and I think he lived through the day. That was my memory.
If we didn't, we're not going to say anything more about it.
Hands and iPhones make for good targets.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
Yeah. So the ATP meters actually work, right, Bob?
They do work. Now, I'll say, and you sort of hinted at this, is that they're like any other tool. If you use them properly and you know what the limitations are and what they do, they work terrifically.
Well, let me tell the audience all about you, Bob.
All right.
So your driver's license number is, and your social security number is, I'm kidding. Bob is president of Strategic Consulting and really has more than 40 years of experience within microbiology, within hygiene industry, certainly industrial hygiene, and environmental areas, commercial and commercial buildings. I think more than anything, Bob, you've been kind of at the forefront of food hygiene, and you have your own podcast. Correct. Or you are part of a podcast that gets into food safety. And beyond all that, I know that you're a friend of the ISSAs and involved with their production of standards as it relates to detectable cleanliness, and friend of mine. So there you go. I told you I was going to tell everybody you were my friend. But with all that, some of the things that we thought you might be able to do before we get started is kind of talk about like the big picture. What kind of equipment is out there? What did people used to do, and what do they do now when they're trying to figure out whether or not things are clean and safe?
Well, yeah, first off, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Scott, for having me on. This is going to be fun. I think we're having a good discussion about ATP. My experience with ATP also goes back about 30 years. There's a lot of other applications for ATP, but as far as this type of application in sanitation, like you said, it did come from food safety, and we learned a lot of lessons there, and now learning how to apply it here. And I think ISSA is the leader in that. Mark, with that question, I might even turn that back on you. I think you know how to inspect the building better than I do and what's available, but I think probably the most likely thing people are doing is visual inspections, flashlights and mirrors and things like that, maybe UV, those type of techniques. And there's a few other techniques like that. But ATP is becoming more widely used because the nice thing about it, and not to say anything about any other inspection technique, but this puts a number on it. It makes it quantitative, and you can compare last week's results with this week's results and see if you're continuing to do as well as you did before, or if things are degrading. You can judge cleaning teams on how they're doing. So it actually puts a number and makes it quantitative, and it also keeps a record. So at the end of a time period, you can look back and have charts and graphs and show how you're doing. That's not possible with visual inspections or other things that are someone's assessment or someone's opinion. So that's one of the real strong points about ATP is it puts a number on it. And so when used, like you said, when used correctly and in the right way, which ISSA has in the standard, it's really valuable for cleaning verification.
You brought up the fact that some of the auditing techniques, cleanliness audits that are done using extension mirrors. And, one of the old tricks dating back a couple decades or more was, walking around with a black light and, you'd go into a boys' elementary school bathroom and flick on a black light and you would be horrified and you'd see people running down the hall going, let me out of here.
It was like a
because
bad
it
Jimi
could.
Hendrix concert.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, a lot of, but how do you quantify that?
Right,
It
exactly.
was bright, it was not bright, whatever. So, quantifying things is what you were doing in food safety. We've seen it really come along pretty heavily in healthcare as well,
Right.
where they want to benchmark where they are and do a trend analysis of how they're improving. And, certainly those two elements, food safety and healthcare, kind of set the stage for the janitorial and sanitary maintenance industry to want to also be able to document where they're at and how they're improving over time. So, so how do these the ATP meters actually work? I mean, do they work better than a black light in a boys' elementary school bathroom?
So let me ask you a question about that, because I don't know the answer to this. Some people have told me that there's the black light dust that people use, and they'll sometimes put it down. And if you clean properly, the dust is gone. So the black light will show that the dust is gone. Is that
Yes.
still something that's used?
Yes, actually, there was a demonstration that was videoed about 2 years ago at Restoration Technical Institute,
Okay.
where they actually sprinkled something. The name of the product was called Glow Germ, but it's a fluorescing powder. And they sprinkled it down on the carpeting and then showed how you could clean the carpeting, show it with the black light showing it
Right.
all over the carpet, and then vacuum it and then extract it and be able to show the differences in how much you actually get out. And after extraction, it was fully gone. So that's kind of a neat way of training somebody on what they're trying to accomplish when they're not actually able to see a visible change.
Right.
Because carpeting hides soil so well. But yeah, that's still one of the processes that are out there to really, more than anything, Bob, it's used for training during onboarding. So people get an idea of what they're trying to accomplish.
Okay. So that's the perfect model to explain ATP, which is why I asked that. So ATP, and this is the last time I'll say this, stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's a chemical, it's a biochemical, it's in anything living. When we talk, we're burning ATP. When we move, we burn ATP. And so anything that's living contains ATP. So dust, because we know what dust is made of, has ATP in it. If there's insects or animals or anything in the air, it's going to have ATP in it. So essentially that dust that you're talking about with UV is the same thing, only what we're looking for is ATP containing surface contamination. And that's what we can detect. Now, in the same way that if you clean to remove the UV dust, it won't show up under a UV. If I clean to remove the ATP that's everywhere, it won't show up on an ATP meter. And the way the ATP meter works is, I don't know if you call it a lightning bug or a firefly, depending upon where in the country everybody's from, it's a different name, but a lightning bug will light up and it has 3 chemicals in it. I don't need to name the first 2. One's an enzyme, and the third chemical is ATP. And when those 3 combine, the lightning bug lights up, and that's how it creates the light. What ATP technology does is provides the first 2 chemicals as part of the reagent in the test. And then if there's any ATP on the surface, it combines, it lights up, and then a very sensitive light meter, which is the ATP meter, reads the measurement of that light. If there's a lot of ATP on the surface, there's a lot of light, you get a high reading, a high number. And the number is called a relative light unit. It's just relative to the test, and higher numbers are higher than lower numbers. This is really what you need to know. And there's details behind the numbers we'll talk about in a second. But if there's not much ATP on the surface, it produces a small amount of light, or sometimes even no light if it's particularly clean. And that's how the whole system works. And just as a feature, it used to be way back in the day that there were people that caught lightning bugs so that you could get those chemicals and harvest them. It's all done synthetically now. So there's much more quality control over the chemicals as well. But that's the background to how it works. And just to show, and we can go back into this later, that's what a test looks like. It looks a little bit like a Q-tip with reagents in the bottom, but the real technology is in the reagents and the chemicals. And then that is what a typical ATP meter looks like. This one happens to be from Kikkoman. That's what it looks like. And when you take a test, you'll drop that into the meter and it'll read the light levels. And that's essentially how the test works. There's a lot of details to how you use it, but that's how the test works.
So one of the interesting comments is before you drop it in there, the reagent is contained in a bulb.
Correct.
And that bulb needs to be fractured so that the reagent can then go down onto the swab.
Right.
Because if you don't do that, you get an amazing zero reading. It's like, wow, this must really be clean.
It happens every time, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Which takes us into like that whole conversation that you and I had previously about how things like this are really useful tools, but you really got to know how to use them.
Yeah.
And one of the concerns is that there are some standards out there that actually reference some metrics that can vary from unit to unit on whatever scale they're particularly reading. And so that's difficult. And I know you've been involved with the redo of the ISSA institutional and commercial standard. So I'd love to have you kind of talk about how that has been modified to adapt to the fact that there's so many different models out there. And then we can go from there into talking about how to use them right.
Okay. So there's some history involved here. There's a couple of ways that you can read that light electronically, and there's a sensor inside the meter. And there's several different kinds of sensors, and each manufacturer has used different sensors. So the light meters are a little bit different, and the way they register the light and how much they can collect changes a bit. So yeah, each model is unique in how it measures the ATP. A lot of it is just legacy on how they were put together. Same thing with the chemistry. The chemistry is somewhat unique, and some companies have modified their chemistry. Kikkoman, the one I mentioned, is probably the one that's most unique, that they've really made the test more sensitive, but several of the other manufacturers also have different levels of sensitivity. Hygiene is a major manufacturer that has 2 different sets of sensitivity. So you have to know those readings, and each one of them will produce a different number. So the one thing that's key to know about ATP is that the standards that you use and the meters that you use have to match. And you can't use one company's swab in their meter. It doesn't work that way. So you have to keep the like brands together. In the ISSA standard, that's accounted for in that there are 5 different instruments that are in the standard. Each one of them has recommendations and what the levels and the ranges are. So that's just a feature of the way the equipment works and the way the instruments or the industry has grown up. And you just have to know that. There's probably not much, there's no way to get around that. That's just something that you have to know.
It reminds me of watching a guy one time who was so proud of what they had done for training on their team. And he said, just watch this, man. I'm going to do an ATP reading out of our bathroom. And he goes in with one swab, Bob. He was in there for like 5 minutes. He comes out with the swab, said, I swabbed everything. Let's see what we got. It's like, that's not how you do it.
Right. Well, that's another great point. One of the things, and you and I talked a bit before the recording, is what are some of the key things you need to know? What are the differences? Well, the one we just talked about with the brands is one of the key ones. The second thing that you bring up now is absolutely important to know. So you had mentioned in one of the questions, is there skill involved? No, I wouldn't say skill. These are really easy to use. I can teach somebody to take an ATP test in a minute. But there are techniques you need to know that will make a big difference in the test. One is, if you're looking for surface contamination, most all the manufacturers recommend using a 2 by 2 inch square. And so if you take that square, and what you're doing with the swab is taking whatever surface debris or contamination, however you want to say, the dust off the surface. And if you take it in a 2 by 2 square, you're getting 4 square inches of whatever is on the surface. If next time you take a 4 by 4 inch square, you just raised the surface area by 4 times. So yes, your numbers are going to come up because you're collecting 4 times more off the surface. So that's key to make sure that the area that you test is relatively consistent. Much more important if the numbers are high or close to the thresholds than they are if it's low, but it's really important to keep that consistent. One place this will come up, and everybody asks this question, is what about something you can't take a 2 by 2 square? How do I do a doorknob? Okay. The recommendations will say, do the best you can to get 4 square inches. But whatever you do, if you take one of the, I don't know how many types of doorknobs are there, 1,000 types you might find, make sure that whatever you're sampling the first time is roughly the same pattern you're going to follow the next time, as close as you can, so that the numbers are consistent. Now, again, if you're getting ATP readings of 50 and you bump it up to 200 because the number goes up, because the surface area goes up, that's not going to be tragic. But if you're getting numbers of 450 and it makes you fail at a 500 level, it could really make a difference. So that's a really important thing, to keep that sample area consistent.
And the standards that the ISSA is putting together, do they get into a little of the detail of the process, or is that really left in the hands of the user to read the manufacturer's instructions for use?
The answer to that is both. It does get into the details, a lot of details, such as how to set standards. You can take the manufacturer's recommendations. There are ways to set background standards and then use a progressive improvement, a continuous improvement. There are ways to test and use a more definitive laboratory test in situations where you have, let's say, a real problem. And I can describe that if you want to get into that. But it also talks about how to sample. It talks about the 4 square inches template, how to make that. It's pretty detailed about that, but you'll probably have to refer to both. One of the issues that comes up sometimes is, so you have sampling. Most of the swabs will look like Q-tip type swabs. There are some manufacturers out there that make flat swabs. So it'll say, hold it at a pressure at an angle, which is appropriate for one type of swab. Holding it perpendicular is more appropriate for another type of swab. So the manufacturer's recommendations will always come into play, used in conjunction with the standards.
So I have a couple more questions for you.
All right.
Shock. So, one of the things that we've been talking about is that the ATP gives you an ability to detect a level of cleanliness. And some of the things that you hear people saying is probably making the wrong assumption, and that is that they think they're detecting a level of disinfection.
Right.
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So ATP is a cleaning validation test. And so I used the model before of the UV dust. Well, if I clean the UV dust, it doesn't mean I'm disinfecting the surface. It just means it's an indicator that I've cleaned pretty well. Bacteria certainly contain ATP, but so does lots of things. So it's not a test for bacteria. You could certainly clean a surface, get a low ATP reading, and leave behind some bacteria that will then grow back. The other problem that you have with saying that something is completely disinfected is the sample size that you're taking. 2 square inches on a surface indicates the level of cleaning, and it's effective at that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire surface is disinfected. So that's something you have to be careful about, is relating this directly to a test for bacteria or viruses or mold. There's certainly a relationship, and if you clean it to a low ATP level, you're going to have very low levels of bacteria, mold, but you can't say definitively, like you could with a laboratory test, that you've disinfected a surface.
The question has come up really regarding things like virus and mold spores.
Right.
And but specifically virus, since they're not necessarily detectable through ATP. And so there is a certain level of assumption that if we had an original count of bacteria and virus, and we're only measuring the bacteria, but we can show that went down, it's the leap of logic that the virus count is reduced as well. Is that pretty much fair to say? And how do we relate all that to spores from like a C. diff environment?
So the first one with viruses, there is some good published data out there show correlation with low ATP levels with virus levels. So the cleaning processes that you would use to remove ATP in a surface also remove viruses. But it is a correlation. It's not definitive. So if I say that I get an ATP level of 5, does that mean that the virus level has, if I drop the ATP level 95%, am I certain that the virus levels have dropped 95%? No, it's a pretty close correlation, but I can't be certain of that. And I can't make that sort of claim that I've cleaned this free of viruses, but you will most likely, again, the correlation is that you'll drop those numbers. But where people go wrong is saying that, oh, I've cleaned this virus free because it's an ATP level. No, that's not how that works. And that's one of the things I mentioned before about using ATP with a definitive test. Let's say you had a building that had some problem with bacteria or mold, and the source of the mold's been removed, but you're still trying to clean it out of the building. If you were to take ATP levels right next to, let's say, a definitive test for mold that you send to a microbiology laboratory, and then look at those levels, how they come down with the ATP levels, you can then use the ATP levels to guide your cleaning. It's not definitive for guiding the removal of the mold, but it'll probably do that, and the relationship shows that it will do that. And then periodically you go back and take a definitive test to verify that. So instead of saying I need a 7 to 10 day test to see if I've cleaned from mold, I can use the ATP and the validated correlation that it has and get a test in 10 seconds that says my cleaning's working, so I'm going to assume it's working, and I'll continue to test for mold to make sure it's working. That's how that process would work.
I got 2 questions to tie in with that. The first one is, how do you get around the fact that you're properly doing the testing is a fairly small patch?
Yeah.
And you've got all these other surfaces in the room. So how do you know which section, where do you decide to test versus where do you not decide to test, and what impact is it? Because I mean, you got a whole, let's say it's a nursing home, you got a whole room. So how does a technician decide, or what's the protocol as to where you actually do your testing?
So there are some numbers in the standard to help with this. So let's say you're looking at a school and you're looking at desks. Right. There's a certain number of desks you should collect. And let's say the numbers, and there's a way of calculating it in the standard. Let's say there's 40 desks. And every time you come in to do a test, you're going to do 10% of those, but a different 10% every time. And then you're going to test a representative surface of the desk. So let's say a normal classroom desk is, I don't know, 2 foot by 3 or whatever they are. And you're going to use that surface and test to make sure that those high touch surfaces have been cleaned. And you'll do the same thing in different areas. So I'll have, let's say, 10 different tests. If they all come up passing, that should be representative of the other 40 desks, and the cleaning process is being followed. If several of them fail, if the average fails, and there's a way to calculate that in the standard as well, then you'll know that you have to do something else with the cleaning. There's always going to be the statistical issue of, if I had tested the left side of the desk versus the right side of the desk was something different. That's always going to be the case. And you can really only solve that with lots and lots of tests, but probably not really needed for, let's say, the things that we're going to talk about, K through 12 schools, commercial buildings, stuff like that.
So the second question is kind of a crazy idea when you're describing how the whole process works. So could you potentially spray down a surface with it's the reagent that's in the swab, right?
Yeah.
Could you potentially spray a surface with the reagent, and then if you had a sensitive enough camera to sense the light that's given off, the energy that's given off, is that another technology that's, because we've seen that from a couple of different companies, but they're kind of going at a different way. Is that kind of a crazy idea, or should I be patenting it right away?
Yeah. Yeah, stop talking about this and get the patent out. Exactly. I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you about other ways that ATP is used, luminescent bacteria and things like that. But the issue with ATP is, even though the reagent produces light, it doesn't produce so much light that it's visible. It would have to be a very sensitive camera. But the other thing that happens is, in the meter, one of the reasons why all the meters have a lid is there's a dark chamber, and when you close it, it
Okay.
excludes all light. So somehow you'd have to exclude the light.
It's not going to give you a number, which is what the benefit of the meter gives you, an actual, some sort of data that you can look at.
Right.
This would be more like, oh my God, you got to go back into that corner because that whole part of the room hasn't been done. But okay, so it's a future technology.
Future technology could be.
Anybody that's listened, don't tell anybody about it. And if you steal my idea, I'll go sue your ass.
Oh, geez. So like to like settle the myth, right from the expert, it basically detects the adenosine triphosphate in the bacteria, but does not detect viruses and does not work to detect mold spores. However, we're able to document the cleaning task took place by showing the reduction in the bacteria count.
Right.
So the other question that has come up, maybe a little bit of misinformation that floats around out there, is that does ATP get picked up after, let's say you disinfect a surface, but and you've killed the bacteria, will it still read in an ATP meter if you haven't removed the corpse of bacteria? So I've been told that it can read living or dead bacteria. And so that there's a reason that we might want to recover a disinfectant slurry. Is there any piece of that that's got merit?
Technically, yes. Practically, potentially, but in most cases, probably not. What happens is, if you want to picture bacteria as like a water balloon, and they're filled with ATP, and that's where a lot of this comes from. And our cells are filled with ATP. If you use certain disinfectants, rather than just killing the bacteria, it will lyse it or explode the balloon, and the contents of the bacteria will be spread. If that's not cleaned off by the cleaning processes, you can actually add more ATP to be detected than otherwise would be detected.
Oh, that's interesting.
That particularly comes in play with things like mold and yeast, where the cells are way bigger and have a lot more ATP. So if you're doing this in a bakery or someplace where there's, some reason there's a lot of yeast, it can happen. In practical application, I think most of the things I've seen is if you use sanitizers that will do that, and you clean the sanitizer so that the surface is dry, generally the cleaning processes that you're going to use are going to remove most of that. Now, if you had, let's say you're in a hospital situation, and I know this happens here, where you had, let's say, a lot of blood on a surface, and you don't clean it very well, but you lyse the blood cells while you're doing that, your ATP numbers actually may go up as you clean. But you're talking about a pretty concentrated bit of contamination on a surface, not what you'd find on a school desk or in most applications.
Well, part of what we're trying to move people away from is shortcutting the whole disinfection process of walking into the room with some kind of magic kill juice in your back and wave the wand around, and then leave saying good to go. And that's actually the biggest problem that exists. I had one other quick question for you, though.
If I could, let me just interrupt you 1 second, because there's another feature to that. And this is one of these things that's a feature of ATP that you need to know, is there are some sanitizers that, because of the chemistry, will change the ATP numbers if the surface is still wet. So in most cases, you want to test after any sanitizers have dried. Now, some of them will have a 5% reduction in the number. Some of them may have a 50% reduction in the number. But again, if you're right at the threshold, it may make a difference. So if you go in with certain sanitizers, spray them around wet, and test with ATP, you're going to have some variance in your numbers.
Thank you. That helps clarify that. And these are questions that I know people have, or they don't even know to ask these questions. The last question that I really had for you, Bob, had to do with the fact that the EPA is going down a path of creating testing mechanisms for residual disinfectants. And some of the residual disinfectants are using things like colloidal silver or things like that. And so one of the comments that was made to me over the last 30 days was that a residual of some types of colloidal silver can actually prevent an ATP meter from getting a reading. Do you know anything about that at all? It basically inactivating the ability to get the activity from the reagents and the adenosine triphosphate.
Colloidal silver is antimicrobial, but I don't know that it affects the ATP chemistry. I can see if there's any data on that. I'm not aware that that would have a significant impact. Now, there is one thing in the standard that people talk about is that sometimes you'll leave a residue of good bacteria behind. You'll use those bacterial augmented cleaning products. And if you leave that type of residual behind, it'll send the ATP numbers through the roof, even though what's on the surface is what you want on the surface. So I know that's a problem.
This has been fantastic. Like,
Great.
this is great. I feel like I got my master's degree in ATP again. So, anyway, Bob,
Yeah.
you've been awesome. I know
Yeah,
we threw
great
some
stuff.
questions at you that we hadn't prepared for, but they were things that came up in our conversation. And really, I think all of this has been a great benefit to the audience. So
We will we'll put in the show notes a link to your podcast as well. So
Okay, good. Thanks.
other people, we will take you off into the stratosphere as far as your numbers are concerned.
Okay, good.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I think it's been very beneficial, and hopefully we answered a lot of questions that people had out there, because I certainly had a lot that you covered very well. So, yeah.
And if anybody had a question, they want to send me an email, I'd be glad to answer any that come up.
Yep, good. Well, thank you very much for joining us on Jancast number, what number are we? 164.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
See you guys.
thank you, Bob.
Bye-bye.